This is one of the larger home projects I've been a part of. It was in Detroit and it was actually part of a TV show. Keisha and her husband had lived, I believe, in North Carolina for a while. They had been in a condo, and so they had just moved to Detroit. They had family in the area. More family was moving back to Detroit, and it felt like the right time to buy a house. And they were starting to dabble in renovations and this idea of potentially flipping homes. So they had specifically looked for a historic home. And through some connections of a contractor, they actually got introduced to a producer for In With the Old on the Magnolia Network. They were excited about the possibility of being on the show, and the show also contributed a certain amount of money to completing the project. So it was a good way to get some publicity and also to get some funds to go towards the projects they were trying to work on. However, she was not super excited about the Magnolia home aesthetic. Like, Joanna Gaines' design was not what she was looking for. Now, that's not me saying that I think it's a bad design style. I'm just saying that wasn't what they wanted. Funny enough, Keisha's grandmother was actually an interior designer, and she had this piece in the corner here is actually one of her grandmother's sketches. And she really appreciated the craft of interior design, and she wanted to work with a designer specifically to make sure that their home felt like their home and that they didn't make choices just for the show or styling for the show that didn't feel like them in the long run. So they wanted to make sure that the money they actually invested in the home led towards the aesthetic they were trying to create and wasn't just trying to get things done in order to shoot for filming. So to start, I think it's really important to talk about what the goal design aesthetic was. Sometimes it's really hard to judge a project if you don't know what the goals were. So sometimes you look at photos of work designers have done and it's either your style or it's not your style. And if it's not your style, you're probably not gonna like the design. But I think when you're evaluating someone's work, you really need to evaluate it against what the goal was, not do I like it, do I not like it, because it's not our home. All of that being said, I want to talk about what their goals were for this project. So they both really liked transitional concepts. Now, specifically, they were really into kind of a CB2 aesthetic where the walls are covered in molding, the architecture is older, there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of wood, and then they liked the concept of mixing really contemporary furniture with that kind of style architecture, which was great because it lended itself really well to the property they bought. So this was an easy kind of concept to translate into their space, which is something I like people to think about when they're working in a certain design style. It's easier to work with what you have instead of working against what's already in the space. Also really loved artwork and music, and they wanted a very sophisticated feeling design. Sometimes a super sophisticated design often just feels more expensive, and a lot of people think that that's because more money was spent. And sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not. They had some money set aside, but they did not have what I would call a large budget. In fact, they never actually gave me a budget. We just kept working little by little, and they would buy pieces as they found appropriate. So this was the goal. And then they also gave me one other piece of inspiration that I'm going to show you. When I first met with them and we first started talking about what style they were hoping to incorporate in the house or what feeling they were looking to achieve, they both mentioned this hotel in Detroit that they both loved, and it's called the Shinola. And this is directly in their lobby. So this was one of the first photos that I saw of the hotel. As a side note, I will say that hotels are a great place for inspiration because you've already been in the space. So I loved that this was what they were sending me because it gave me a really good base to go off of. The hotel is a very mid-century modern in terms of the furniture and the styling. However, there were little elements that they really liked and wanted to incorporate. So you'll see there's a lot of artwork here. They like the way the artwork was presented. They really loved the dark molding on the windows of the bedrooms. And then they really liked the wood tones used here. As I mentioned, I was hired to help them create their home long term. I wasn't hired specifically for the show project. However, the bathroom was meant to be part of the show. And so this was one of the first spaces that they wanted me to work on, and it was kind of the first space that was giving them a little bit of pause. Because as you can see in the first photo, the bathroom is pretty much the complete opposite of everything I've just showed you that they liked. But they liked the tile. The tile was really pretty. It seems very bright in these photos, but in person, it's a little more muted. They actually sent me a piece of the tile, which was super helpful in coming up with a color palette and a plan moving forward. But as you can see, we kind of have this very retro, bold, bright tile in a house that otherwise was pretty neutral, had a lot of wood, felt very antique, and so this felt like a deviation from the rest of the house. And so the challenge here was one of two things. They wanted a bathroom that felt sophisticated and was going to match the aesthetic that the rest of the house was going to be in, but at the same time, this was going to be their son's bathroom. So I had to walk this very fine line of sophisticated and childlike. And if you would like to watch the entire process, because this bathroom was a process, I do have a series breaking down this specific bathroom, but this is where we landed. So we picked a fun wallpaper that incorporated colors from the rest of the house. This dark teal was a color that was going to be used in multiple spaces, whether it was going to be on window molding or part of another wallpaper. We had built a consistent color palette for the home. It helped us incorporate this very bright green color into the rest of the home. So that's why we ended up choosing this wallpaper. And then I used other elements through texture. So the gold in the lighting, the wood frame around the mirror, to bring in more elements to elevate the design. Both options here were options we played with. These are not the most sophisticated design layouts, but they get the job done for my clients. So this is what we go with. The first one, you can kind of see that we had played with the idea of adding a darker paint color on the ceiling to kind of give the bathroom a little more of a moody feel. We also played with the idea of painting the trim around the windows a darker color to kind of offset and bring in those colors into the space. We ended up choosing a striped shower curtain. Shower curtains are very hard to buy like off the shelf. So when you're looking for something super specific, and this doesn't always happen with most people's projects, but for this bathroom, we needed something so specific that we ended up buying material and having the shower curtain made. I think the entire project was around $300. And I'm not saying that's a cheap shower curtain by any means, but it ended up being the best solution to our problem because that shower curtain was going to take up so much visual space and it needed to coordinate with this wallpaper. Now on the right, you can see a piece of artwork. We were playing with this idea of adding more sophisticated pieces of artwork to the bathroom to kind of elevate the overall feeling, even though we were using the wallpaper to bring in a more childlike element. So again, we were really trying to walk a very fine line here. Final results are in the show. It's very similar to what you see here. Certain items didn't come in time, but if you'd like to see the wallpaper installed, you can actually watch me install it in the video. Now, the living room project sort of was, but wasn't featured on the show. I do think they give a full image, and I have a video of what the living room looked like, but the actual design execution was not done for the show. So only certain parts were. And you can kind of see here that we had a lot to do before we could even get to a place of design. There was water damage, there was plaster issues, I believe there was an electrical issue in this space. So there was a lot of groundwork that had to be done before we could even really focus on design. But you can see it's a fun space. They have this really pretty fireplace. They have really pretty wood moldings. Not all of it was in good shape. We had to kind of take down and piece things together to make it work, but we were really focused on preserving what we could of that wood. So as I mentioned, a lot of this was staged for the show, but I'm gonna show you what the design plans are for the future. So this is a design concept that was going to be used moving forward. We wanted to take and kind of work with this juxtaposition between antique pieces, contemporary pieces, and modern artwork. And so you can see all of that incorporated here. They wanted some fun accent chairs. They wanted to incorporate more wood into the space. We did that through this coffee table. And then we also took some inspiration from the Shinola. When we were looking at this space, as I said, there was a lot of wood molding that could be used, but it couldn't be used the way it was currently being used. And so they really like this idea of kind of a chair rail or separating the room, which you can see here. So what we ended up doing was bringing the molding up so it was in line with the fireplace. If we had done it higher, so typically when you do a chair rail, it's either a third of the way up the wall or 2/3 of the way up the wall. And the fireplace was sort of in between the two. But if we had gone higher or lower, it would have looked really awkward with the fireplace. So we used the line of the fireplace as our guide for where that chair rail was going to go. And then as you can kind of see here, the top half was going to be a lighter paint color. The bottom half was going to be a slightly darker paint color. And that did get finished for the show. So that video is kind of where we left the project when we personally left Detroit. So you can see the painting detail has been done. They did end up, this couch is the couch that they purchased that would stay in the space. And then the artwork was in the space, but everything else was staged for the show. So what you see in the show is not what the room is going to be. The primary bedroom was another area that we focused on a lot because there was a lot of challenges in this bedroom. So you can see on the left hand here kind of the space, and then right next to it is the layout. It was a small room. It had a lot of cutouts or kind of interesting layout options. Because this was a historic home and it didn't have central heating or cooling throughout the entire space, this was something they had to do from a functional standpoint. But then it became a really big headache for Keisha in terms of design because she really didn't want to see that unit on the wall. So we played with a couple different ideas. We went back and forth for a couple of months. The idea we kind of landed on is shown on the far right here, that there would be curtains that were in front of, you can see here, there's a bump out. So the idea is that the curtains would cover kind of the bump out, give us a flat wall to work with. We could bring the bed forward, and then they could push the curtains aside when they were actually using the AC unit because they're in Detroit and they wouldn't be using that unit all year round. So that was where we finally landed, but we went through a bunch of options from built-ins to paint to optical illusions. Like, we really went through all the things. Because it took some time to kind of piece through all the different options and for them to make decisions on what they wanted to do, none of the work for this got done for the show. So these were the design concepts. This is a personal wedding photo of theirs. I'm only sharing this because they have shared this on social. Their faces are all over the show. So in general, I don't tend to put my clients' faces on things, but like I said, this is all already public. So the photo on the left is the original design that I started playing with for them, very reminiscent of the hotel. Mid-century modern pieces, contemporary shapes, a lot of the jewel tones and color palettes that they wanted to use in the house. But she came back and they both felt that it was too playful or childlike. They wanted something still more sophisticated. And so the two options on the right are where we landed. They really wanted these rich, warm tones. But I will say they both loved pieces from Restoration Hardware. And Restoration Hardware furniture is not cheap. So when we started to play with these designs, they loved all these options, but they didn't want to make all these purchases at once for the show because they didn't have the money set aside to do that. So that's one of the reasons that the bedroom was not done for the show. The bedroom is staged on the show, but I'd like to make it clear that that was not the design or even the path that that space was headed in. And if you watch the show, it feels very disconnected from the rest of the house. Now, the kitchen was one of the projects that was heavily featured on the show. And I was brought in about a third of the way into the project. So they had already had someone come in and do kind of structural plans, and the contractors had started on the kitchen. I want to say, as a side note, a lot of people think that contractors kind of are designers or have some expertise in kind of how to plan a layout. And 90% of the time that's not true. So there are some functional things that I'd like to point out in this kitchen that if I was working with them before all these plans started, I kind of could have helped mitigate. So for starters, the island here is really like inappropriately sized. There was not enough room in this kitchen to have an island, and they kind of forced this into the design concept. But even in the show, you can kind of see at the end as people are trying to move around the kitchen, there's just not enough space. So when they brought me onto the project, my kind of set of to-dos was a paint color and furniture for this space. So they wanted really unique bar stools. They wanted to do a nook or built-in or dining room table. They didn't really know. That was one of the things we had to work through. But when I was looking for bar stools, the counter height was not a normal counter height. Then all the stools, because of how deep they weren't going to work because the sizing in the kitchen wasn't appropriate. So if someone was sitting on a bar stool on the island, you weren't going to be able to open a single cabinet behind you. No one was going to be able to walk behind them. They bought a refrigerator that they then had to return because it was a single door and it was hitting the island because there wasn't enough space. So then they had to switch and go out and buy a double door refrigerator. There was a lot of sizing issues in this space that were inappropriate. And I say this just because, again, I think most of us assume that a contractor is going to tell you those things, but a contractor is hired to just do exactly what you tell them. And so to me, those are kind of functional issues that if I was paying for a kitchen renovation, like I would not be happy with. And a lot of these kind of issues aren't things you think about until you're having the issue in the kitchen, and then it's kind of too late. So I don't know that they'll be super happy with the function of the layout long term, but at the time they were really just excited to have a kitchen that was finished and usable. And I will say the kitchen looks really nice for the show. One of my projects specifically for this space was this big chandelier. So they had antique chandelier pieces that the previous owner had left them that they wanted to incorporate, but then they wanted to add something dramatic over this island that also kind of tied in with these pieces without being an antique. So this was a specific challenge. The sizing requirements of this were very specific. I ended up finding this piece. I originally found it from West Elm. What I liked is that the shape of the glass on these pieces had an antique feel, but then the structure, kind of the metal framework of this light was more contemporary. So it really walked this line very well of the two styles we were trying to pair, and it didn't dramatically take away from kind of the moment or highlighting some of these antique pieces, because I also didn't want the two to compete or the piece over the island to be so dramatic that you didn't notice this beautiful antique chandelier when you walked in. Now in these photos you can't even see the chandelier because of the angle we're at, but when you're physically in the space and you walk in, you really see the antique piece first. So as I mentioned, one of the projects I was working on was kind of what to do seating wise in the kitchen. They played with the idea of a very long dining room table. They played with the idea of a circular dining room table with a bench. They played with the idea of a long oval that extended from the bench. Again, we went through a lot of options here, but ultimately settled on a built-in bench. The space lended itself really well to this. Like, we already had these beautiful windows looking out at the backyard. Like, it just made the most sense to utilize that space. But that bench didn't get built until a couple days before filming, so that's why you see me like down on the floor painting the bench. Then these were the two furniture options we went through. And what I like to kind of highlight at this point is, again, when you're planning a space, everything has to kind of complement and play off each other. So I couldn't pick a dining room table without considering both the bar stools and the dining chairs. But we had a lot of sizing constraints, as I mentioned, because of the stools. They wanted something that was dramatic, but also padded. And then the sizing for those things became an issue. One of the things we did really want to focus on was bringing another wood tone into the space. There were really beautiful wood floors. There was really beautiful wood cabinets, and we didn't want to detract from those things, but we also kind of wanted to add on to that palette. So both of these table options here were to add to the wood tones. Now you'll see one is more of a contemporary take, one is a more traditional take. One is not better than the other. It was up to them based off preference, and you'll see that I put a lot of prices here so that they also could make a decision based off price. For the show, they ended up getting these exact dining chairs, but then last minute she found a black base that someone had like custom built on Facebook Marketplace, and it was like $100 last minute. So she ended up getting that, which obviously we lost the wood element, but for $100, like, I wasn't talking them out of it. And then she found a marble top, a white marble top that ended up going on top of that table. So that's kind of where we ended. They had the shape, they changed kind of the materials a little bit, but it still worked with the rest of the space. I'm always very conscious of how much money my client is spending to acquire certain pieces, and I'm very vocal about whether I think that's needed or not. So this kitchen was beautiful. Like, the highlight was the kitchen cabinets, the island. And so if they didn't want to spend the money on a table, it doesn't necessarily make sense to spend money on a phenomenal table, because the table was never going to be the star of the show. And so I do try and kind of go back and forth with my clients about budget, not because I'm convincing them to spend more money, but in a lot of ways, I'm trying to help allocate money where it's going to have the biggest impact. And the table was never going to have the biggest impact of this space. All of this being said, I know that this project looks like an expensive project. And in a lot of ways, I'm sure it was. A big chunk of their design budget went towards contractors. They renovated the kitchen, they renovated an upstairs bathroom, which is also shown in the show. But what I want to do is show my pricing and my work. So as you saw, those were the design concepts they got. They did get a custom piece of artwork. They did get a lot of DIY instruction. So I helped them learn how to paint, how to wallpaper. Like, we did a lot of DIY projects for the show. And then there were also at least 6 to 8 hours of consultation calls going back and forth. Now, my pricing structure has changed slightly since. I learned a couple like business to-dos and not to-dos through this process, but that is the amount that they paid me in total for all of my work. As I mentioned, they weren't planning on buying everything at once. They were planning on making purchases over time, and there were certain pieces they cared a lot about and wanted to invest in the higher end option. And then there were certain pieces that if it popped up on Facebook Marketplace and worked with the design, then that's the direction they were going to go in. And I always encourage my clients to do that. So I cannot tell you what all these projects ended up costing in total. A lot of these things are still in progress. It can take 5 to 10 years for a home to be fully furnished and decorated. And I want to make that more transparent to people, because design shouldn't feel so inaccessible because you don't have some massive amount of money set aside to do everything in the world right now. What I want to show is that by paying a little bit of money for expertise in design plans, you can kind of take away all the anxiety of spending money on things over time because you know what it's going to look like in the end. So my services are really meant for that purpose, to help give you a peace of mind and something to be excited about as you're spending money, and the flexibility, as I said, to kind of find pieces at lower price points, but to know what you're looking for. So this price is my service price. Obviously, that's not what they spent on the entire project. I hope you've enjoyed getting to walk through this project. If you watch this and you decided you would like help on a project, please check out my services page. There are 2 different ways we could work together at different price points because I want this to feel accessible for everyone.